All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're objectively unpacking a very specific, highly detailed Christian theological text. It's a source that sets out to define, analyze, and ultimately offer a really strict critique of paganism from a distinctly biblical perspective. Whether you're a theology buff or completely new to this kind of religious framework, it's genuinely fascinating to see how texts like this structure their arguments. We're going to look strictly at what the author is arguing, how they construct their definitions, and the specific scriptures they use to build a deeply critical view of what they call the pagan path. So we start with a pretty compelling question. Who exactly is a pagan? Because as the source text acknowledges right out of the gate, the target is constantly shifting depending on who you ask. The word itself carries a whole lot of historical and cultural baggage. Before the author can even begin to critique the belief system, they first have to wrangle with the fact that the label pagan is just highly subjective. Here is our roadmap for the text. 1. Defining the term. 2. Practices and core beliefs. 3. The biblical critique. And 4. The role of Satan. Section 1. Defining the term. Let's see how the author actually attempts to pin down this concept. It's actually pretty fascinating when you look at the historical root of the word. The text notes that the term originates from the Latin word paganus, which literally just translates to country dweller. Historically, the author links this term to ancient Rome, associating it with polytheism, the worship of multiple gods. So it basically started out as a demographic descriptor before morphing into this major religious identifier. And this perfectly illustrates just how relative the term has become over the centuries. From a Christian viewpoint, the author notes a pagan is generally someone caught up in acts that aren't distinctly Christian. But the text also points out that Jews and Muslims use the exact same term to describe anyone outside of their respective religions. And if you go even further, some secular definitions argue a pagan is simply someone with no religion at all. The text highlights this to show that for major world religions, pagan is essentially a catch-all term for the other, basically anyone operating outside of their specific faith perimeter. Okay. Having established that broad relativity, the author then zooms right in on their specific characterization. According to the text, a core component of both ancient paganism and modern neo-pagan movements, like Wicca or Druidry, is hedonism. The author defines this as a pursuit of worldly delights, sensual pleasures, and self-indulgence. The text explicitly draws a line from ancient sexual ceremonies, referencing Old Testament condemnations, directly to contemporary practices. The argument here is that they all rely heavily on sensual gratification to the exclusion of everything else. Moving on to Section 2, Practices and Core Beliefs. Now that the text has set its definitions, we shift to the specific philosophical tenets the author attributes to these groups. Despite the massive variety in practices out there, the author actually boils the overall pagan worldview down to 7 shared beliefs. It's basically a philosophy where the physical world is inherently good, humanity is deeply tied to Mother Earth, and divinity is found in absolutely everything. In this view, everyone is essentially a god or goddess, and they prioritize personal responsibility over strict doctrines or messiahs. Plus, there's a heavy reliance on natural solar and lunar cycles for guidance. So it's a worldview deeply rooted in the physical, natural world and the divine within the self. Section 3. The biblical critique. This brings us to the absolutely crucial point of the text's argument, the theological critique that firmly labels any form of paganism as false doctrine. Let's see how they build this. To construct this critique, the author draws really heavily on the Apostle Paul's letter to the believers in Rome. The fundamental friction here is a contrast of worship. The text argues that paganism fundamentally errs by worshiping created things, like trees, animals, and rocks, rather than worshiping the Creator who actually made them. In this specific theological framework, elevating the material world to a divine status is viewed as a deep perversion of truth. The source text anchors its whole condemnation right here, in Romans chapter 1, verse 28. The author uses this passage to argue a direct cause and effect. Basically, abandoning the traditional knowledge of God leads directly to what the text characterizes as a depraved mind. According to the author's reading of Paul, this is exactly why these ancient and, by extension, modern groups fall into worldly, materialistic, and deviant practices. It's presented as the inevitable end result of looking to nature rather than God. And finally, Section 4, the role of Satan. In its climax, the text escalates its theological warnings significantly, moving beyond just a critique of misguided nature worship to introduce the concept of direct demonic influence. Now, you might be wondering about this. And the author actually acknowledges a very common pushback right here. The text plainly states that most pagan worshippers claim they don't even believe in Satan. The author fully recognizes that from the practitioner's own perspective, Satan is a Christian concept, not a pagan one. But the text definitely doesn't let that stand in the way of its theological conclusion. Despite the practitioner's active denials, the author leverages a passage from 2 Thessalonians to insist that Satan is actually the chief source of influence and control behind all these movements. The text argues that Satan operates through deceit, lies, and counterfeit miracles. In the author's view, the practitioners don't have to literally believe in Satan to be controlled by him. They're simply falling victim to a powerful delusion. So, the crucial takeaway here is this final severe warning. From this highly specific Christian perspective, the explainer concludes that pagan worship, even in today's postmodern world, is not just an alternative lifestyle or some harmless connection to nature. The text emphatically declares it to be the deceitful work of the devil, the prince of this world, who prowls like a roaring lion. Therefore, the author's final, unambiguous directive to faithful believers is that paganism must be entirely avoided, no exceptions. As we wrap up our analysis of this highly charged theological text, it really leaves us pondering that severe final warning. By looking at how this source defines its terms, outlines opposing beliefs, and applies strict scriptural interpretations, we get a crystal clear view of how this specific religious critique is constructed. It asks you to choose a lens. Is what we call the pagan path merely a nature-based alternative worldview, or, as this text so forcefully argues, the ultimate spiritual deception? It's a fascinating look at the mechanics of theological argumentation. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.